In today's documentary, we dive into one of the most extraordinary moments in ancient history, the first great military campaign ever recorded in detail. We're going to uncover how Egypt, under the newly independent rule of Thutmose III, marched into the Levant to confront a rising coalition of rebellious Canaanite princes. You'll see how political tension, bold strategy, and a dramatic gamble on the battlefield shaped a confrontation that would echo for centuries. If you enjoy journeys into the ancient world like this one, remember to like the video and subscribe. And now, let's begin the story. After the long and steady reign of Hatshepsut, Egypt found itself at a crossroads. Her government had emphasized internal prosperity, monumental construction, and controlled diplomacy rather than large-scale military expansion. This approach brought stability, but it also signaled to Egypt's northern vassals that the empire's attention was turned inward. When Thutmose III finally emerged as the sole ruler, free from the regency and overshadowing authority of his stepmother, he inherited a state that was strong in wealth and administration, but weakened in its influence beyond the Sinai. For decades, provincial rulers in Canaan had experienced few direct consequences for testing Egyptian patience, and their increasing boldness was beginning to threaten the cohesion of the empire's outer territories. Thutmose III, though relatively young, understood the weight of the crown he now carried alone. He had spent years waiting, watching, and learning, and once he gained undisputed authority, he acted with decisive clarity. Reports arriving from the north painted a picture of growing disorder. Local princes, once deferential to the might of the pharaoh, were now forging ambitious alliances, emboldened by the shifting balance of power in the region. The rising influence of Mitanni, a formidable state to the northeast, added fuel to the fire. If Egypt failed to reinforce its presence, the delicate network of vassal loyalties might collapse entirely, leaving the empire exposed and its prestige shattered. Among all the rebellious voices echoing across the Levant, one stood out unmistakably: the ruler of Kadesh. Charismatic, politically astute, and eager to loosen Egypt's grip, he succeeded in uniting numerous Canaanite city-states under a single cause. This coalition represented not just an expression of defiance, but a coordinated challenge that threatened the essential trade arteries linking Egypt to Syria. The alliance's decision to gather around Megiddo was strategic rather than symbolic. Situated at a vital junction of inland and coastal routes, Megiddo was a prize whose control determined who commanded the heartbeat of the region's commerce, communication, and military movement. For the coalition, holding Megiddo meant they could intercept caravans, disrupt Egyptian tribute systems, and position themselves to either repel or dictate terms to any southern army attempting to restore order. For Egypt, losing influence over this city would have meant conceding not only territory, but authority, something a newly empowered pharaoh could not allow. The threat was immediate and structural, not a mere border skirmish. An unchecked rebellion in such a critical location could inspire other vassals to seek autonomy, fracturing the imperial architecture that past generations of Egyptian rulers had carefully maintained. Thus, the young pharaoh's decision to march north was not driven by pride alone. It was a calculated response to a situation that endangered the ideological and economic foundations of the empire. Egyptian authority depended on predictability, tribute flowing regularly, local rulers remaining loyal, and foreign powers recognizing the pharaoh's supremacy. The uprising, and particularly the concentration of resistance at Megiddo, challenged that predictability at its core. Thutmose III recognized that if his first independent military action failed, the consequences would reverberate far beyond a single campaign. Success, on the other hand, would announce to allies and rivals alike that Egypt had reawakened as a formidable imperial force. This moment, therefore, marked a turning point in Egyptian foreign policy. No longer would the northern territories be managed with passive oversight. The coming campaign would demonstrate that Egypt was prepared to impose order through strategy, discipline, and sheer determination. Thutmose III's advance toward Megiddo signaled more than the start of a military expedition. It marked the reassertion of a global power stepping back onto the stage with confidence and ambition, ready to reshape the political landscape of the ancient Near East. The mobilization of the Egyptian army began with a level of coordination that reflected centuries of accumulated military tradition. Thutmose III understood that to confront a coalition as unified and determined as the one gathering at Megiddo, he needed an expeditionary force that combined discipline, mobility, and tactical versatility. Egypt did not field massive armies by later imperial standards, but it deployed highly trained contingents capable of moving with remarkable speed. Troops were drawn from garrisons throughout the Nile Valley, supplemented by Nubian auxiliaries known for their skill with bows and close-quarters combat. Military scribes worked tirelessly to account for equipment, provisions, and transport animals, ensuring the pharaoh's march would not stall due to shortages. The structure of the army reflected a balance between infantry and chariotry. Egyptian infantry formed the core of the force, divided into companies that could maneuver efficiently on varied terrain. They carried composite bows, spears, axes, and protective shields crafted from wood and hide. Chariot units, reserved for elite warriors, acted as mobile platforms for archers, providing both offensive reach and rapid movement across open plains. The chariots themselves, light and elegantly constructed, symbolized not only military power but also the prestige of those permitted to ride them. For Thutmose III, mastering the use of these components in harmony was essential. The campaign ahead would demand coordination across distances far greater than most Egyptian soldiers experienced in their regular duties. Supporting such a force required meticulous logistics. Grain, dried meat, water containers, spare equipment, and medical supplies had to be gathered and distributed in advance. Pack animals and carts formed a supply line that followed the infantry, creating a moving infrastructure capable of sustaining the army deep into foreign territory. Logisticians anticipated issues such as heat, water scarcity, and wear on harnesses and weapons. The army's movement relied on predictable stages, each planned to coincide with sources of water, critical for both men and animals. Egyptian commanders were acutely aware that a well-fed, well-supplied force could maintain morale and cohesion, while any disruption could rapidly undermine the campaign. As the army began its march northward, the landscape shifted dramatically from the fertile floodplains of the Nile to the arid expanses of the Sinai and beyond. Sand, heat, and rocky ridges challenged the soldiers' endurance, while changes in elevation slowed the movement of chariots and supply carts. Scouts were dispatched ahead to identify suitable campsites and to monitor any signs of ambushes from forces loyal to the coalition. Despite these challenges, the army advanced in good order, driven by the pharaoh's presence. Thutmose III did not lead from a distant palace. He rode with his troops, reinforcing discipline with his visibility and ensuring that every stage of the march reflected his personal authority. Meanwhile, in the Levant, political loyalties were shifting like desert winds. Some Canaanite rulers, uncertain of how the confrontation might unfold, hesitated to commit fully to the coalition. Their cities depended heavily on trade with Egypt, and many feared that an outright rebellion could backfire if Thutmose III succeeded in reasserting his influence. Others saw an opportunity to gamble on independence, hoping that the coalition led by Kadesh would finally break Egypt's dominance over the region. This mixture of fear, ambition, and opportunism produced an unstable patchwork of alliances that the pharaoh had to navigate carefully. Egyptian intelligence networks played an essential role during the march. Messengers and informants stationed in friendly cities reported growing restlessness, cautioning that the coalition's leaders were pressuring wavering princes to join them at Megiddo. The pharaoh understood that speed was crucial. If he arrived before the alliance fully solidified, he could strike with maximum effect. If he delayed, the coalition might grow strong enough to mount a prolonged resistance, jeopardizing the success of the entire expedition. As the march continued, the Army AS movements signaled an unmistakable message to all who observed them. Egypt was returning to the northern theater with purpose. Each forward step closed the gap between Thutmose III and the coalition that challenged him. The rising tension was felt not only in the camps of the soldiers, but also in the halls of Canaanite rulers, who now realized that a decisive confrontation was approaching, one that would determine whether Egypt's authority would be reaffirmed or rewritten. As the Egyptian army pushed deeper into the Levant, Thutmose III called his commanders together, for a council of war, an ancient yet decisive tradition that blended military pragmatism with the ritual reverence due to a ruling pharaoh. The officers gathered around him were seasoned men, many of whom had served under Hatshepsut and understood the stakes of the campaign. Yet even among these experienced figures there was tension. Ahead of them lay Megiddo, where the coalition had positioned itself with deliberate care. Before the army stood three possible approaches, each carrying distinct advantages and dangers. The council's deliberations would ultimately shape the fate of the entire expedition. The northernmost route offered a broad and relatively safe passage, with ample room for the army to maneuver and low risk of ambush. However, its convenience came at a strategic cost. The coalition would almost certainly anticipate this choice and station defensive forces along the way. The central route was shorter but still predictable. It provided better terrain for chariot movement, yet left the Egyptians open to early detection, negating any element of surprise. Both paths were respectable options, the kind of decisions a cautious commander might choose to preserve the integrity of his forces. Then there was the third route, the narrow pass of Aruna. This path cut directly through rugged terrain, twisting and constricting into a single-file passage in certain segments. To attempt it meant exposing the army to catastrophic risk. A small enemy detachment stationed at the exit could trap the Egyptians, preventing the infantry from forming ranks or allowing chariots to deploy effectively. Any ambush within the pass itself could result in panic, confusion, and the total collapse of the column. It was, by every traditional measure, the least advisable option, and yet it was also the one most likely to catch the coalition by surprise. Its difficulty made it a route no rational enemy would expect the Egyptians to take. As the council debated, Thutmose III listened carefully, weighing both the caution of his officers and the opportunity that lay before him. He had no illusions about the dangers, but he also understood that this campaign required more than caution. The coalition held the advantage of position and preparation. To defeat them, he needed to undermine their expectations. Choosing Aruna would turn the campaign from a conventional march into a bold display of strategic audacity. When he finally announced his decision, the council fell silent. The pharaoh had chosen the most perilous route, and by doing so, he committed the entire army to a gamble with no margin for error. The reaction among the soldiers was complex. Many were trained to obey without hesitation, yet whispers carried through the camp that the chosen path was barely wide enough for a man and his equipment, let alone chariots or pack animals. Some worried that the coalition scouts had already reported their movements. Others admired the pharaoh's boldness, believing he sought a swifter victory than a prolonged confrontation might allow. Thutmose's presence among them steadied nerves. He did not hide behind formality, but rode alongside his troops, demonstrating personally that he would face the same risks they did. His confidence became a stabilizing force, an assurance that the gods favored their cause. Meanwhile, the Canaanite alliance waited near Megiddo with growing anticipation. The leaders of Kadesh and their allies believed that the Egyptians would approach from one of the two broader routes. They had deployed scouts, fortified positions, and prepared their troops accordingly, confident that they had effectively channeled their enemy into an expected confrontation. The possibility that Thutmose III might attempt the Aruna Pass seemed so irrational that it was dismissed outright. Their attention was focused on maintaining cohesion among the monarchs gathered under the coalition banner, many of whom were anxious and restless as they awaited the Egyptian arrival. This imbalance in expectations, Egypt taking a path deemed impossible, the coalition assuming predictable behavior, created the conditions for one of the most decisive maneuvers of the campaign. As the Egyptians prepared to enter the Aruna Pass, they did so with a mixture of tension and determination. Each soldier understood that a single misstep could doom the entire force. Yet they also felt the exhilaration of taking part in a daring strategy that had the potential to catch their enemies unprepared. The gamble was immense, but so was the possible reward. If the army emerged safely from the pass, they would descend upon Megiddo with an advantage no amount of coalition planning could erase. In this moment between calculation and action, Thutmose III demonstrated the style of leadership that would later earn him a lasting place among history's most respected commanders. He was willing to listen, willing to analyze, but ultimately willing to take risks that others would have avoided. The march toward Aruna was not merely a tactical decision, it was a statement of intent, a clear indication that the pharaoh would confront rebellion, not with hesitation, but with a boldness that could redefine the balance of power in the region. The passage through the Aruna route began before dawn, when the shadows still covered the rocky slopes surrounding the narrow trail. The Egyptian army advanced in a long, stretched-out column, its formation dictated entirely by the terrain. At several points, the path constricted so severely that only one man at a time could pass. At others, a pair of soldiers could walk side by side if they pressed close to the cliff face. Chariots, symbols of elite warfare and pride of Egypt's military, posed a particular challenge. Their wheels scraped against stone, and the drivers had to dismount and help guide the vehicles manually through the tightest bends. Even the horses moved uneasily, sensing the confined quarters and the unnatural silence that hung over the column. Every sound, the clink of metal, the creak of leather straps, the shuffle of sandals, seemed amplified by the canyon walls, reminding the troops just how vulnerable they were. Maintaining cohesion under such conditions required discipline beyond ordinary training. Officers moved constantly along the line, encouraging their men to keep pace and preventing gaps that could cause bottlenecks. The slightest delay threatened to ripple backward, immobilizing the entire army and creating the perfect opportunity for an ambush. Scouts were dispatched ahead, climbing the surrounding ridges to scan the horizon for enemy movement. Their reports, delivered in hurried whispers, confirmed that the pass remained surprisingly quiet. No coalition forces had been sighted, no suspicious signals observed. Each hour that passed without incident strengthened the belief that the pharaoh's gamble might indeed succeed. The pharaoh himself played an essential role in preserving morale. Thutmose III positioned himself toward the front of the column, visible to the soldiers who could glance ahead and see their ruler enduring the same precarious journey they faced. His presence acted as a stabilizing anchor. If he was unafraid, the troops could draw confidence from his resolve. Though the soldiers understood the inherent danger of the march, they also recognized the magnitude of the opportunity before them. Successfully navigating this treacherous path would allow them to appear at Megiddo from a direction their enemies had not fortified, granting a tactical edge that no amount of brute force could replicate. Hours passed in this slow, methodical advance until finally the terrain began to widen. As the column emerged from the narrowest stretches of the pass, the soldiers released the tension they had held in their chests since entering Aruna. The sight that unfolded ahead offered both relief and exhilaration. Beyond the final ridge lay open ground, the perfect space to reorganize their ranks and prepare for battle. Most importantly, there was still no sign of enemy troops. The coalition had miscalculated. Their scouts had monitored the two predictable routes, but failed to anticipate that Thutmose III would risk the nearly impassable one. The Egyptians had achieved a complete and unexpected breakthrough. As word of the army's successful emergence spread down the column, the atmosphere shifted from anxious suspension to energized purpose. Officers began directing units to form traditional combat lines, the infantry tightening into cohesive blocks, while chariot crews reassembled their teams. Weapons were checked, armor adjusted, and the supply line corrected to keep pace. Despite the physical strain of the journey, the men felt invigorated by the knowledge that they had outmaneuvered their opponents before a single arrow had flown. Meanwhile, miles away, the coalition encamped near Megiddo remained unwavering in their assumption that the Egyptians would appear along the broader approaches. Their scouts had spotted movement along one of the expected routes earlier in the day, likely a deliberate Egyptian diversion, and reported this confidently to their leaders. Convinced of their preparations, the coalition commanders focused on reinforcing their positions and maintaining unity among the many kings gathered at their side. The possibility that Thutmose III had chosen the Aruna Pass simply did not occur to them. It was a move that defied conventional logic, and leaders accustomed to predictable warfare could not imagine an enemy willingly placing his entire army in such jeopardy. The illusion shattered abruptly when coalition lookouts finally observed stirring in the distance, movement in a direction they had dismissed as irrelevant. Dust rising where no significant force should have been, glints of light reflecting off metal, faint but unmistakable lines of troops forming with precision. Realizations spread through their ranks like wildfire. The Egyptians had not only chosen the most dangerous route, they had passed through it unharmed, and now stood poised to strike from a flank the coalition had left underdefended. Shock rippled through the coalition leadership. Some rulers panicked, urging an immediate retreat to more defensible positions. Others demanded that their forces reorganize quickly to confront the unexpected threat. Debates erupted, accusations flew, and unity wavered. Their carefully crafted strategy had hinged on predicting the pharaoh's movements, yet they now found themselves reacting instead of directing. The psychological advantage shifted instantly to Egypt. The element of surprise, born from a decision that most commanders would have rejected outright, now shaped the battlefield, even before blades met in combat. As Thutmose III's army prepared to advance upon the plains surrounding Megiddo, the pharaoh's calculated gamble had already begun paying dividends. The coalition's confidence fractured, their formations scrambled to adjust, and their leaders struggled to regain control of a situation spinning wildly beyond their expectations. The passage through Aruna had transformed from a risky march into a masterstroke of strategic deception, one that would set the stage for the dramatic confrontation soon to unfold. As the Egyptian army emerged fully from the Aruna pass and approached the plains near Megiddo, Thutmose III wasted no time reorganizing his forces into battle-ready formations. The terrain ahead consisted of open fields framed by low ridges and the fortified city perched on elevated ground. This setting offered room for chariot maneuvers, but also forced both sides to consider how the natural contours would shape the clash. The pharaoh's officers worked swiftly, positioning infantry at the center and chariot divisions on the wings. The long, tense march through the mountains had not drained the troops. Instead, the sense of having defied the coalition's expectations energized them. Thutmose III, fully aware that surprise still played in his favor, pressed for a quick and orderly deployment before the enemy could fully respond. Meanwhile, confusion rippled through the Canaanite camp. Their commanders had assumed the Egyptians would appear from the southeast or east, not from the unguarded southwest flank. Scrambling to adjust their preparations, they attempted to reposition troops into lines facing the new threat. However, the coalition's loose network of alliances complicated this process. Each contingent answered primarily to its own leader, not to a unified command. Messages took longer to circulate, orders overlapped or contradicted one another, and the initial deployments formed unevenly across the field. The leader of Kadesh, despite his influence, struggled to impose the cohesion needed to counter the Egyptians' rapid formation. When the first maneuvers began, the difference in organization became immediately visible. Egyptian infantry advanced methodically, shields raised, bows prepared, and officers calling cadence to maintain formation. Chariot squadrons on the wings moved in tight, disciplined arcs, ready to intercept enemy attempts to flank or break through the infantry line. The Egyptians' confidence radiated from their steady pace. They had emerged exactly where the coalition least expected them, and they now sought to exploit every second before the enemy regained its balance. The Canaanite chariots, positioned hastily across the uneven terrain, launched the earliest charges. Their charioteers hoped to disrupt the Egyptian formation before it could solidify. Yet the ground between them, a mix of shallow depressions and rising slopes, was far from ideal. Chariots struggled to maintain speed over the irregular terrain, and several crews were forced to veer aside to avoid hazards that the Egyptians had already accounted for. When the first wave collided with the advancing Egyptian line, it did so without the unified shock that a well-planned chariot assault required. Egyptian archers responded with volleys that struck both horses and crews, slowing the momentum of the charge and forcing some Canaanite chariots to withdraw before making decisive contact. Sensing a weakening in the enemy's left flank, Thutmose III ordered his own chariotry to surge forward. The Egyptian chariots, lighter and more maneuverable than many of their Canaanite counterparts, accelerated across terrain they had chosen deliberately. With two-man crews, one driver, one archer, they delivered precise attacks, loosing arrows in rapid succession while maintaining steady speed. Their movements resembled sweeping crescents, cutting into exposed fronts and then veering out before the enemy could counter-strike effectively. The pressure on the coalition intensified as more Egyptian units joined the push. On the coalition's right wing, several contingent leaders attempted to rally their forces, urging their infantry to reinforce the faltering chariot line. But the terrain around Megiddo constrained their efforts. The city's elevated position meant that some units were forced to navigate uphill slopes or detour around rocky outcroppings before they could join the fight. These delays weakened the coalition's ability to respond cohesively. For every group that managed to form up properly, another arrived out of position or too late to make the intended impact. Still, the Canaanites were not entirely unprepared for battle. Their infantry, equipped with spears and large shields, engaged the Egyptian foot soldiers with determination. Skirmishing erupted across the center, with both sides exchanging arrows before closing in for hand-to-hand combat. Moments of fierce resistance slowed the Egyptian advance and prevented an immediate breakthrough. Yet even here, the Egyptians demonstrated superior coordination. Officers maintained tight control over their companies, ensuring that no unit pressed too far forward without support. The coalition, by contrast, showed signs of uneven discipline as some contingents pushed aggressively while others hesitated, unsure of the broader plan. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Each time the Egyptians pressed a coordinated advance, the coalition line bent but did not immediately fracture. Each retreat or repositioning among the Canaanites created ripple effects, causing pockets of disorder that their commanders struggled to contain. The pressure was unrelenting, not the overwhelming collapse of an army defeated by brute force, but the steady erosion caused by sustained tactical advantage. Thutmose III used the terrain's natural corridors to guide his infantry and chariots into positions where they could outmaneuver the coalition's heavier and less coordinated divisions. The leaders of the Canaanite alliance felt the mounting strain acutely. Their expectation of confronting the Egyptians from prepared and fortified positions had dissolved into a frantic effort to respond to an opponent who seemed always one step ahead. Every time they attempted to reorganize, another Egyptian maneuver disrupted their plans. The psychological burden of facing a foe who had already outwitted them before the battle even began weighed heavily on the coalition's confidence. By late in the engagement's opening phase, several sections of the coalition line began to waver visibly. The Egyptians sensed this vulnerability. Thutmose III's gamble at Aruna had not only granted him the element of surprise, it had positioned his forces to dictate the rhythm of the battle. The coalition commanders now found themselves fighting not just to hold the field, but to preserve the unity and morale of their disparate armies, even as Egyptian pressure tightened with each passing minute. The moment the opening maneuvers gave way to full concentrated combat, the battlefield near Megiddo erupted into a chaos that only disciplined armies could navigate. Thutmose III, positioned where he could observe the unfolding lines, recognized that the time had come to shift from probing tactics to a decisive strike. His officers relayed orders swiftly, tightening the Egyptian center and extending the wings to widen the pressure on the coalition's formation. This reorganization occurred with remarkable fluidity, a testament to the professional training of the troops. Units moved like interlocking segments, adjusting to new positions without losing cohesion. Archers stepped forward to unleash coordinated volleys, softening the enemy ranks, just as infantry surged ahead to exploit the resulting gaps. Across the field, the coalition struggled to maintain order. Their initial disarray had never fully recovered, and the growing pressure from the Egyptian wings now threatened to fold the entire line inward. The ruler of Kadesh attempted to rally his forces, shouting commands to close the widening breaches. Some contingents responded with determination, pushing forward to meet the Egyptian advance, but others hesitated or failed to hear the orders amidst the noise of battle. The result was a fragmented defense that bent unevenly, with pockets of resistance isolated from the main formation. Egyptian chariots circled these stressed points, firing arrows with deadly accuracy, and forcing the coalition fighters to divide their attention between immediate threats and flanking attacks. The fighting intensified as infantry lines clashed in close combat. Shields slammed together, spears thrust through the dust-filled air, and the metallic rhythm of weapons striking armor created a relentless din. In the thick of it, Thutmose III demonstrated the leadership style that had begun defining his reign. He moved where he was needed, reinforcing weakening positions and signaling fresh advances. His presence among the troops had a galvanizing effect. Soldiers fought with renewed vigor, knowing their pharaoh not only commanded but shared the dangers at their side. Gradually, the cumulative effect of Egyptian discipline, combined with the coalition's fractured coordination, triggered a breaking point. A surge on the Egyptian right wing succeeded in pushing back a major contingent of Canaanite infantry. As they retreated, they collided with their own chariot units attempting to regroup, creating confusion and collapsing any semblance of order. The disruption spread rapidly. Those who saw the withdrawal assumed it marked a larger failure and began falling back themselves. The leader of Kadesh attempted desperately to halt the developing rout, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The coalition, no longer fighting as a unified force, dissolved into clusters of retreating warriors fleeing toward the fortified city. Once the retreat began, panic accelerated it. Chariots overturned as their drivers attempted sharp turns on uneven ground. Infantry sprinted for the safety of Megiddo's gates, only to find the sudden influx of fugitives clogging the entrances. Some climbed the slopes around the city in frantic attempts to escape the Egyptian advance, while others discarded shields and weapons to run faster. The battlefield became a landscape of abandoned equipment, wounded fighters, and disorganized flights toward the city's looming walls. As the coalition collapsed, Egyptian troops surged forward to capitalize on the victory. They overran the coalition's camp, which had been hastily abandoned as the defenders fled. The camp overflowed with provisions, equipment, chariots, and personal belongings of high-ranking leaders who had escaped with nothing but their lives. The capture of this vast supply cache marked a symbolic and strategic triumph. It testified to the scale of the coalition's defeat and provided the Egyptian army with abundant resources. Even more importantly, it exposed the vulnerability of the coalition's leadership. Their possessions now lay in Egyptian hands, signaling to all Canaanite rulers that their rebellion had suffered a humiliating setback. Yet amid this dramatic success, the Egyptians made a critical mistake. Instead of pursuing the fleeing coalition forces immediately, many soldiers turned their attention to the camp's wealth. The value of the seized goods, fine fabrics, chariot parts, weaponry, livestock, proved too tempting. They began gathering spoils rather than chasing the enemy into the city before the gates could be shut. This lapse in discipline, though understandable from a soldier's perspective, had significant strategic consequences. The pharaoh's officers attempted to redirect the troops, but the opportunity slipped away. In those precious minutes, the coalition forces managed to scramble inside Megiddo and secure its defenses. By the time Thutmose III regained full control over his troops and attempted to press the advantage, the gates had closed firmly behind the fleeing enemy. The city, perched on its high mound, was not merely a refuge. It was a stronghold capable of withstanding prolonged resistance. The chance to finish the battle decisively in the field had been lost, replaced by the necessity of a siege that neither side had initially anticipated. What might have been a swift and total Egyptian victory evolved into a protracted standoff. The coalition, though battered, now found itself behind walls that could delay the pharaoh's plans for weeks or even months. The Egyptians, triumphant yet frustrated, recognized that the campaign had entered a new phase, one dictated not by battlefield maneuvers, but by patience, engineering, and containment. The siege of Megiddo was about to begin, an outcome shaped as much by Egypt's brilliance as by its brief moment of overconfidence. When the gates of Megiddo slammed shut behind the fleeing coalition forces, Thutmose III confronted a new and complex challenge. The battlefield victory had been decisive, but it was not final. The fortified city, perched atop its mound with steep slopes and sturdy walls, could not be taken by force without unacceptable losses. To secure the long-term stability of Egypt's northern holdings, the pharaoh needed not only to defeat the coalition, but to eliminate any possibility of its leaders regrouping. Thus began a siege that would test the endurance, engineering, and administrative capacity of the Egyptian army. As thoroughly as the battle itself, Thutmose III moved swiftly to encircle the city. His officers surveyed the terrain, marking strategic points around the mound to establish a complete blockade. The goal was simple: no supplies in, no escapees out. Workers, soldiers, and engineers collaborated to construct a fortified perimeter known as a circumvallation, a continuous line of defenses designed to prevent any relief force from breaking the siege or any coalition members from fleeing. This barrier took the form of trenches, ramparts, and wooden palisades, forming a ring that gradually tightened around Megiddo. The Egyptians even built a structure they proudly recorded as the Thutmose Wall, a testament to their commitment to containment. Within days, the Egyptian camp had transformed into a stable, organized encampment resembling a temporary city. Supply wagons arrived from the south, ensuring the army remained well provisioned. Livestock grazed in controlled areas, wells were dug or restored, and workshops emerged to repair weapons and chariot components. A siege was not merely a waiting game, it required continuous labor and careful management. Thutmose III understood that a hungry or restless army was vulnerable to disease, dissent, or overconfidence. His presence kept morale steady, and his clear strategy gave purpose to every unit involved. Inside Megiddo, however, conditions deteriorated almost immediately. The city had not been stocked for a long siege. Its rulers had expected to win the battle outside the walls, not to seek refuge behind them. Thousands of soldiers and civilians now pressed together within cramped spaces, each day consuming food that could not be replenished. The coalition leaders attempted to impose rationing measures, but rumors of scarcity fueled unrest. The challenge of feeding horses, especially the numerous chariot teams, proved particularly damaging. Without sufficient fodder, animals weakened quickly, reducing the coalition's mobility and diminishing its ability to mount any counterattack. Despite their precarious situation, the leaders of the coalition did not surrender quickly. They attempted occasional sorties, sending small detachments down the slopes to disrupt Egyptian work or test weak points in the siege lines. These efforts were short-lived. The Egyptians repelled them with disciplined volleys and countercharges, forcing survivors back behind the walls. Each failed attempt confirmed that the city was effectively trapped, and each loss increased tensions among the coalition commanders. Their alliance had been founded on confidence and ambition, but confinement eroded the unity that had once made them formidable. Negotiation attempts emerged sporadically. Envoys descended from the city carrying messages proposing temporary truces, safe passage for civilians, or concessions meant to buy time. Thutmose III rejected these overtures, aware that any agreement short of total submission would embolden other vassal states. His goal was not merely to end this rebel alliance, but to make an example of it, demonstrating the consequences of testing Egyptian authority. The Pharaoh's refusal to compromise forced the coalition to confront the grim reality of their situation. No reinforcements were coming, and no diplomatic maneuver would break the siege. The psychological impact of encirclement grew heavier with each passing week. The Egyptian camp thrived. The besiegers had ample food, medical care, and the stability of routine. Inside Megiddo, the contrast was stark. Water became more precious, stores of grain dwindled, and illness spread among the population. The once confident princes of Canaan found themselves unable to offer solutions. Their soldiers, who had fled the battlefield in hopes of finding safety behind the walls, now realized that they were slowly starving. As the coalition's strength eroded, internal disputes resurfaced. Some leaders blamed the ruler of Kadesh for persuading them into the rebellion. Others argued that surrender was the only option left to prevent complete destruction. Attempts to keep morale high, speeches, promises, even ritual appeals to their gods, grew increasingly ineffective. The simple, inescapable fact of encirclement weighed on every mind. They could see Egyptian fires burning in the distance night after night, an unbroken ring of light that reminded them their fate was no longer in their own hands. By the end of the siege's long stretch, the coalition's resolve had thinned to the point of breaking. Supplies were nearly exhausted, and the defenders were physically and psychologically depleted. The leaders understood that continued resistance would lead to famine and potentially an internal revolt. The once proud alliance that had dared challenge the greatest power of the age now faced the inevitable conclusion, of its failed gamble. What had begun as a bold attempt to reshape the political landscape of the Levant was dissolving under the weight of hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless presence of an army determined to restore Egyptian supremacy. Thus, the siege did not end with a dramatic final assault or a heroic last stand. It ended with slow, grinding inevitability, the collapse of will inside the walls, worn down by the very strategy Thutmose III had enacted from the moment the city gates closed. The pharaoh's patience had accomplished what weapons alone could not, setting the stage for the surrender that would follow, and reshaping the region's balance of power for years to come. When the defenders of Megiddo finally accepted that no relief force would break the Egyptian encirclement, the decision to surrender emerged not as a bold act of diplomacy, but as an admission of complete exhaustion. Hunger had eroded the last traces of resistance. Horses had collapsed in the streets, grain stores were nearly depleted, and the once confident ranks of the coalition had dwindled into a weary collection of men clinging to survival. At dawn on a quiet morning, envoys descended the steep slope, carrying tokens of submission, branches, cloth strips, and gestures signaling their readiness to negotiate unconditional terms. For Thutmose III, this moment represented the culmination of weeks of patient strategy and decisive leadership. The pharaoh received the envoys with the formality appropriate to a victorious ruler. They begged for clemency, acknowledging their failure and offering assurances that the city would open its gates without further resistance. Thutmose III agreed, insisting that all leaders involved in the rebellion present themselves before him personally. One by one, the princes of Canaan emerged from Megiddo, dressed not in their finery, but in humble attire meant to convey remorse. They bowed before the pharaoh, touching the ground in gestures of submission, a public display meant to erase any doubt regarding Egypt's reasserted supremacy in the region. The surrender marked the beginning of an extensive accounting process that Egypt recorded with meticulous detail. Scribes moved through the conquered city and the coalition camp, cataloging every item of value. The list of spoils reflected both the wealth of the Canaanite alliance and the completeness of their defeat. Hundreds of chariots, some elaborately decorated, lay in Egyptian custody. Thousands of horses were seized, despite many having weakened during the siege. Warehouses filled with grain, fine textiles, bronze weapons, shields, and armor were transferred to Egyptian control. The sheer quantity of goods captured indicated that the coalition had invested heavily in its campaign, perhaps believing that victory would secure new territories. Instead, those investments now replenished Egypt's treasury. Prisoners formed another significant portion of the spoils. The Egyptians captured not only soldiers, but also high-ranking officials and members of the defeated rulers' households. Many of these prisoners would be resettled in Egypt, serving as laborers or integrated into state-run projects. Others would be returned eventually, but only after their cities offered guarantees of loyalty and accepted Egyptian oversight. This system of controlled release reinforced the pharaoh's authority and ensured that no rebellious prince could regain influence without Egypt's consent. Thutmose III, while stern in enforcing submission, understood the importance of balancing punishment with pragmatism. He allowed the princes to retain their positions as long as they pledged renewed allegiance, provided hostages, and agreed to tribute obligations. By reinstating them rather than replacing them with Egyptian administrators, he maintained a network of rulers who were now personally indebted to him. Their survival depended on loyalty, and their cities remained bound to Egypt through a system of tribute that solidified long-term control. The tribute collected after the surrender included metals, agricultural goods, livestock, and luxuries that symbolized the region's prosperity. More importantly, it included commitments of annual payments, taxes that would flow directly to the pharaoh and remind the Levantine states of Egypt as dominants. For many vassal princes watching from afar, the sight of their peers bowing before Thutmose III and handing over treasures served as a stark warning. Resistance carried consequences that could not be undone by distance or diplomacy. Politically, the victory at Megiddo transformed Egypt's relationship with the Levant. The campaign had begun as a response to rebellion, but evolved into a demonstration of imperial might. Thutmose III had not merely put down a revolt, he had redefined the boundaries of Egyptian influence. The repercussions reverberated across the region. Cities that had wavered in their allegiance during Hatshepsut's reign now reaffirmed their loyalty. Others, previously hesitant or opportunistic, sought closer ties with Egypt, hoping to benefit from stability rather than gamble on opposition. The pharaoh's triumph also elevated his standing within Egypt. His successful campaign, recorded in detail on the walls of the Karnak temple, presented him not only as a capable leader, but as a conqueror in the mold of his greatest predecessors. The battle and siege demonstrated tactical brilliance, strategic patience, and the ability to pivot between diplomacy and force when circumstances demanded. The inscriptions emphasized that the gods had favored his march, portraying him as an instrument of divine will, restoring order to the world. Such narratives reinforced his legitimacy and strengthened the bond between the throne and the priesthood. In the broader context of ancient geopolitics, the victory consolidated Egypt's position as the dominant power in the Near East. With the coalition dismantled, no regional force remained capable of openly challenging Egyptian supremacy. Trade routes fell securely under Egyptian supervision, allowing merchants to move goods with confidence. The pharaoh's envoys and tax collectors traveled across Canaan, working with local rulers to maintain the political framework that the victory had restored. The surrender of Megiddo thus became more than the end of a campaign. It marked the reassertion of Egypt's imperial identity, expanded its sphere of influence, and ensured a generation of relative stability in the Levant. Through a combination of military strength, strategic foresight, and calculated mercy, Thutmose III transformed a rebellion into an opportunity, one that fortified his empire and left a legacy engraved in stone and memory alike. In the aftermath of Megiddo, Thutmose III and his advisors worked systematically to transform a single military victory into a durable political order. The collapse of the Canaanite coalition did not merely reaffirm Egypt's authority, it opened the way for a deeper, more structured integration of the Levant into the imperial system. The pharaoh recognized that triumph on the battlefield would mean little if the region were allowed to drift back into the patterns of autonomy and opportunism that had sparked the rebellion. What followed was a carefully orchestrated program of territorial, administrative, and diplomatic adjustments that reshaped the balance of power across the Near East for decades. The immediate territorial consequence was direct Egyptian control over key trade corridors and strategic sites. Megiddo itself, now firmly tied to the pharaoh, became a hub for Egyptian oversight in northern Canaan. Egypt did not annex every city it subdued. Its imperial model favored indirect rule, but it established garrisons at critical locations, ensuring that officials loyal to the pharaoh could monitor traffic, collect tribute, and maintain order. These fortified outposts served as nodes in a network that extended Egypt's reach far beyond its traditional sphere, creating a web of influence rather than a scattered patchwork of loosely governed vassals. Administratively, Thutmose III implemented reforms that tightened communication between Egypt and its northern territories. Local rulers were required to send their sons as hostages to the Egyptian court, where they would be educated in Egyptian customs, language, and bureaucracy. This practice not only guaranteed loyalty, but also cultivated a generation of leaders culturally aligned with Egyptian interests. These princes formed a class of intermediaries who understood both their native populations and the expectations of the pharaoh, smoothing the functioning of imperial governance. Tribute systems also became more structured. Instead of sporadic offerings or loosely defined obligations, the cities of the Levant were bound to regular payments that included precious metals, agricultural produce, manufactured goods, and horses, resources essential to supporting Egypt's military campaigns and royal projects. The flow of tribute strengthened Egypt's economy and reinforced its political dominance, as every shipment symbolized the submission of faraway lands to the authority of the Nile. The campaign's impact on Egyptian foreign policy marked a profound shift. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt had emphasized diplomacy and trade, prioritizing stability and wealth over aggressive expansion. Thutmose III, however, embraced a more assertive strategy. Megiddo demonstrated that the pharaoh was willing not only to project military power, but to do so in a sustained and far-reaching manner. His later campaigns, many of them conducted annually, extended Egyptian presence deeper into Syria, at times bringing him into direct confrontation with major powers such as Mitanni. The empire that emerged from these efforts was more ambitious, more interventionist, and more connected to the broader struggles of the ancient Near East. Diplomatically, the victory at Megiddo reshaped how neighboring states interacted with Egypt. The message was unmistakable. Egypt was capable of rapid mobilization, bold strategy, and unwavering persistence. Even distant kingdoms, previously content to watch regional developments from afar, now acknowledged the pharaoh's strengthened position. Some sought alliances, offering gifts and envoys. Others kept a cautious distance, ensuring they did nothing that might provoke Egyptian intervention. The political map of the Levant stabilized under this pressure, not because tensions vanished, but because few dared to challenge the empire that had proven its ability to crush coordinated rebellion. The influence of Megiddo extended to the conduct of warfare as well. Future Egyptian military planning drew heavily from Thutmose III's example. The use of intelligence networks, the coordination of infantry and chariot units, the logistical sophistication of long-distance campaigning, these became hallmarks of Egyptian military doctrine. The Aruna maneuver, in particular, served as a case study in the value of calculated risk. Commanders across the region took note of the implications. Conventional expectations could be shattered by a leader bold enough to defy them. Beyond Egypt, the campaign sent ripples through the political dynamics of the Near East. Neighboring states, observing how quickly the coalition collapsed under strategic pressure, began refining their own approaches to alliances and warfare. The realization that a single miscalculated rebellion could provoke a full-scale imperial response encouraged more cautious diplomacy. Even Mitanni, the powerful kingdom to the northeast, adjusted its strategies, recognizing that Egyptian confidence and resources had been revitalized by the victory. Within Egypt, the legacy of Megiddo endured in monumental inscriptions and royal annals, shaping the narrative of Thutmose III's rule. The campaign was portrayed not just as a triumph of arms, but as a restoration of cosmic order, a theme central to Egyptian ideology. By subduing rebellious lands and re-establishing harmony, the pharaoh reinforced the idea that Egypt existed at the center of a divinely sanctioned world. His successes validated his reign, strengthening his position domestically and securing support from the elite classes, who admired the prosperity and prestige his campaigns brought. In the generations that followed, Megiddo retained its reputation as the campaign that ushered Egypt into its golden age of military expansion. It demonstrated the effectiveness of a well-coordinated imperial system, the importance of maintaining influence through both force and diplomacy, and the potential of decisive leadership to reshape the political landscape far beyond a single battlefield. Through victory at Megiddo, Thutmose III laid the groundwork for an empire that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for years to come, an achievement whose consequences echoed across centuries of ancient history. Megiddo occupies a singular place in the historical record, not simply as a dramatic clash between Egypt and a Canaanite coalition, but as the earliest fully documented military campaign in human history. While wars and battles had been fought for millennia before Thutmose III marched north, none had been recorded with such meticulous detail. The annals carved into the walls of the Karnak temple preserve not only the broad strokes of the conflict, but the very mechanics of the campaign: routes chosen, supplies gathered, councils held, and strategies debated. For historians, Megiddo is a window into the military, political, and logistical thinking of the Late Bronze Age, allowing modern readers to observe an ancient army operating with a level of organization once assumed beyond its time. This achievement elevated the battle from a regional conflict into a touchstone of historical inquiry. The completeness of the account offered rare insight into the relationship between ruler and army, the structure of imperial administration, and the mindset of a civilization that saw warfare as an extension of divine order. Egypt's scribes understood the significance of what they were documenting. The victory at Megiddo was not merely an event worth celebrating, It was a testament to the pharaoh's ability to restore harmony to a world threatened by disorder. By immortalizing the campaign in stone, they ensured that future generations would not only remember the outcome, but appreciate the method behind it. Central to this legacy is Thutmose III himself, whose reputation as one of antiquity's greatest military strategists was firmly established at Megiddo. The young pharaoh demonstrated an instinct for bold yet calculated risk, choosing the narrow Aruna pass in defiance of conventional wisdom and reshaping the battlefield before the coalition realized what had happened. His ability to maintain discipline, respond to rapidly changing conditions, and integrate diverse units, infantry, chariots, archers, and logistics, revealed a commander with vision far beyond his years. Although he would go on to fight many more campaigns, Megiddo became the defining moment of his military career, a victory that showcased the combination of daring and precision that would characterize his later conquests. Thutmose III's enduring reputation rests not only on his battlefield achievements, but also on the long-term results of his leadership. His approach at Megiddo demonstrated how military action could serve broader political goals. He understood that defeating an enemy in open battle was only the first step. The true measure of success lay in reshaping political landscapes, securing loyalty, and ensuring long-term stability. The siege, the surrender, and the subsequent reorganization of Canaanite territories all reflected this deeper strategic insight. It was a model of empire building that would influence successors for generations, both within Egypt and beyond its borders. The impact of the Megiddo campaign extended well outside Egyptian civilization. In the broader Near East, the battle signaled the rise of a new imperial power with unprecedented capacity for sustained, organized warfare. Neighboring kingdoms learned that alliances formed against Egypt required far more coordination, discipline, and preparation than had been mustered by the Canaanite coalition. This realization contributed to a new era of diplomatic complexity, as states sought alliances, marriages, and treaties that could offer security in a world increasingly shaped by imperial power. The Amarna letters, written a century later, show a political landscape deeply influenced by the precedents set in Thutmose III's time, an international order built upon negotiation, tribute, and the careful management of relationships among great and lesser powers. From a military perspective, Megiddo revealed the effectiveness of integrated strategies that combined intelligence, logistics, and tactical innovation. Armies of subsequent centuries, Hittite, Assyrian, Babylonian, developed their own systems of long-distance campaigning, fortified supply lines, and coordinated unit movements that echoed the principles demonstrated by Egypt. The battle's documentation became a kind of foundational lesson in ancient warfare. The importance of preparation, the value of surprise, and the necessity of maintaining discipline in the face of both opportunity and danger. Even in modern scholarship, Megiddo remains a pivotal reference point. The campaign allows historians to trace the evolution of military planning, the role of royal authority in warfare, and the dynamics of late Bronze Age politics. It stands as a reminder that ancient battles were not chaotic brawls, but sophisticated operations shaped by terrain, diplomacy, and human decision-making. The fact that this moment is preserved in such vivid detail elevates its significance, giving it a place not only in the history of Egypt, but in the broader narrative of human conflict. Ultimately, the legacy of Megiddo is defined by its dual nature. It is at once a story of a singular battle and a lens through which we understand the foundations of ancient imperial power. Thutmose III's triumph resonates because it captures a moment when strategy, leadership, and circumstance converged to alter the course of history. The echoes of that victory shaped the Near East for generations, influencing political structures, military techniques, and the very way rulers perceived their responsibilities to their realms. Through Megiddo, the ancient world left us a blueprint of power, one that continues to inform our understanding of civilizations long vanished yet never forgotten.